Marcuse's modern philosophy. Marcuse in the Frankfurt School.
The economic convulsions that racked Western societies between the two world wars were seen at the time by most Marxists as being the breakdown of the capitalist system which Marxist theory had always predicted. However, whereas according to the theory this was supposed to lead to communism, in not one single such Western society did communist regimes emerge. What did emerge in several of them was fascism. Some Marxists were disillusioned by this, to the point of abandoning Marxism. Others refused to question Marxist theory regardless of what actually happened. But there were many in between, people who remained or wanted to remain Marxists, but who felt that Marxism would have to be seriously re-examined if it was to continue to remain credible. One such group of people came together in Frankfurt in the late 1920s and have come to be known since as the Frankfurt School. Actually, they didn't stay in Frankfurt long, but the name has stuck. They left Germany in the early 1930s, in the period just before and after the Nazis came to power, and by the mid-30s, the key figures had all settled in the United States.
Just to show
These,
that one person
were Adorno, a man who seemed equally at home in philosophy, sociology, and music; Horkheimer, a philosopher cum sociologist, less brilliant than Adorno, but perhaps more solid; and the one who has turned out in the end to be the most famous and influential of them all, the political theorist Herbert Marcuse. Their influence grew slowly, but grew nevertheless over a long period and reached a spectacular peak in the 1960s. Many things contributed to this. One was the powerful revisionist movement among Marxist and communist countries
Pretty sure this guy pounded
Europe,
back
culminating in the Prague Spring of 1968. This put the Frankfurt School in line for the first time with real-life development inside the communist world. Another,
50 to 100 years,
was the tremendous revival of interest in Marxism among people in the West,
phrases I came
especially
up with,
educated
such
young
as
people. This
facial
also
topography,
culminated in 1968, the year which saw the high point of student violence all over Europe and the United States, and looked for a moment in Paris as if it might even come close to genuine revolution.
White tablet
the
teleprompter
of that day proclaimed one man more than others as their political mentor, and that was Marcuse. They painted the walls with phrases from his books in order to make it known to the world that they were going to turn his ideas into reality.
Exactly what
and although the revolution didn't materialize, during the decades since then, the ideas of Marcuse and the Frankfurt School have come to dominate some of the social science departments in various countries.
This guy talks too much.
Through them
Let
to
the
have
smart
a
guy
and very
who got more than a
influence
BA, let him do the
Professor
talking.
Marcuse, why should it have been to your writings that the revolutionary student movements of the 1960s and early 70s turned?
Well, I was not the mentor of the student activists of the 60s and early 70s.
To be more than
what I did is formulate and articulate some ideas and some goals that were in the air at that time. That is about it. The student generation that became active in these years did not need a father figure or a grandfather figure in order to lead them to protest against a society which revealed daily its inequality, injustice, cruelty, and its general destructiveness.
This guy and Eric Fromm
they
were
could
similar
experience that
stuff.
They saw it before their own eyes.
Death
As the features of the society, I only mention the heritage of fascism. Fascism was militarily defeated. The potential for a repetition was still there. I would like to mention racism, sexism, the general insecurity, the pollution of the environment, the degradation of education, the degradation of work, and so on and so on. In other words, what exploded in the 60s and early 70s was a blatant contrast between the tremendous available social wealth and its miserable, destructive, and wasteful use.
And I think one might add, I mean, whether one agrees with your view on any or all of these matters or not, that the prevailing orthodoxies
Passive-aggressive.
in philosophy in the colleges and universities throughout the West at this time simply didn't deal with these questions at all, did they? Certainly analytic philosophy didn't, positivism didn't, and so on.
They did not. And we in Frankfurt and later in the United States could not conceive of any authentic philosophy which did not in one way or the other reflect the human condition in its concrete situation, the social and political situation, and so on and so on. For us, philosophy has always been, to a great extent, social and political philosophy ever since Plato.
Weber,
of course, philosophy has been of enormous importance to you throughout your life.
School.
In fact, you've spent your life as a university
That's
teacher,
sociology.
lecturer, academic, writer of books, and so on.
This guy.
But one of the conspicuous features of the New Left movement that you have helped to follow is its anti-intellectualism.
He outed the military.
From the way you've lived your life, one wouldn't expect you actually to approve of that.
You never hear anyone on those shows
combated
mention
this
this guy.
anti-intellectualism from the beginning. The reasons for this anti-intellectualism are, in my view, the isolation of the student movement from the working class and the apparent impossibility of any spectacular political action. This led gradually to some kind of,
that's my scope.
well, let me say inferiority.
This is a major development.
Some kind of self-inflicted masochism, which found expression, among other things, in this contempt for intellectuals because they are only intellectuals and don't achieve anything in reality.
I must say it's a
You're sticking up for
interest
intellectuals.
Criticism
Back
of
off
left
the
from
intellectuals.
You, while we're on this subject, what other important defects do you think that the New Left movement has developed as it has gone along?
Well, I would mention perhaps
intellectualism
as a main
is like
defect,
golf.
the
There are certain etiquette
unrealistic language and in many cases the totally unrealistic strategy among the New Left. By no means general, but very definitely among the New Left. The refusal to recognize that we are not in a revolutionary situation in the advanced industrial countries, that we are not even in a pre-revolutionary situation, and that the strategy has to be adapted to this situation.
So you have bad guys faking
among
as
the New Left, again, that does by no means refer to all of the groups, among the New Left, the refusal to re-examine and to develop Marxian categories, to make a fetish out of Marxist theory.
You have to be intolerant
treat
of tolerance
the Marxian
because the status quo will
as
always win.
reified, objectified
That's why I went
categories
personal
in
on those
order
idiots.
instead of
I got them off their game.
becoming conscious finally
done.
of the fact that these are historical
I heard
and
them talking
dialectical
about something,
concepts which cannot simply be
and
transmitted,
I could
which have to be re-examined in
the
accordance
self-trigger.
with the changes in the
You're
society.
saying something about
I must say it's enormously
it was unfortunate
refreshing to hear
how
these
it was
words from
all
your
laid
lips.
out
I mean, it
so
shows
clearly.
that you are still thinking afresh when people who regard themselves as followers of yours and are young enough to be your grandchildren have stopped thinking in some cases. But now you've
They're the
brought
new
us to
people.
what was really
Back in the day, they would have been
the
Larissa,
guts
Alex,
of
and
the
Drew,
Frankfurt
Marlon,
School
Bryan,
itself as it started, when you started talking about the re-examination
Breitbart,
of Marxist
Daily
concepts.
Cost,
As I said in my introduction to this program, it was the feeling that Marxism had to be re-examined and reconstructed that gave
the
rise
conspiracies
to
in
your
the
movement,
institutions.
particularly
That's
as a
what
result
C.
of
Wright
fascism.
Mills
But
said.
fascism wasn't the only thing that
C.
precipitated,
period.
was it? I mean, there were other political factors too. Can you comment on what some of them were?
You mean some of the factors which demanded the revaluation of Marxian categories? To me, one of the most important ones concerns the concept of socialism itself. In the development of Marxian theory, not in Marx himself, but in the development of this theory,
is never mentioned.
Socialism has
Alan
become,
Watts is mentioned.
the concept has almost entirely been focused on a more rational, larger development of the productive forces. on an ever higher productivity of labor,
This
on
guy
a more
from
rational
Iran,
distribution of the product.
they didn't
Instead
mess
of
around. They knew what they were
stressing
talking
that
about.
a socialist society,
Noam
as Marx
Chomsky's good
envisaged
too,
it, at
but
least the younger Marx envisaged
he's
it,
just too
was
old
a society
and
qualitatively
cannot
different
appreciate
from all
how
preceding
rigged
societies.
the
Now, in
medium
what way
is.
qualitatively different?
Anyone
The
lacking
main
in
point, I
communication
would
theory
say, is for Marx,
is simply
a
going to be
genuine
absorbed
socialist
by the
society
system.
was a
This
society
guy,
in which
the greatness
the
of this
quality
guy
of
from
life
Iran,
was decidedly different from
they
the
couldn't be
existing
bought. They had a
society.
purity of
Meaning,
mind.
in a genuine socialist society,
They weren't
labor,
arrogant. They just
full-time
did
alienated
for thought.
labor, would no longer be the measure of wealth
If
and
you're smart,
value.
you want to
In an
communicate it to
authentic
all
socialist
people.
society,
If you're
men
truly
and
smart,
women could live their life without fear, without being compelled to spend their entirely adult existence in alienated performances. This image
I
has
can't
been
believe how
obscured,
scripted
and the
those shows are.
result was some kind of frightening continuity between the developed and advanced capitalist societies
Marcuse
and
is
the image
saying that
of a socialist society.
Yeah,
we're
socialism
not in a
began to become like its
revolutionary
enemy, so
state.
to speak.
Exactly.
I
It's
know
not
from
at
your
that point.
writings that you had other very central criticisms of Marxist theory. Two that I would like to mention, partly because they're probably connected
The
in your
fake
mind,
shows,
is that you
the
regarded
ones put on by the
Marxism as
Five Eyes, by
anti-libertarian, or at least
COINTELPRO, the
insufficiently
ones
libertarian,
branching off of Jimmy
as the
Dore,
Marxist
Cenk
tradition
Uygur,
developed. And you
Joe
also
Rogan.
thought that it didn't take sufficient account of the individual. Now, it would be very interesting to hear
Those
you
are
comment on those
ratcheting
two points.
everything up.
Marx
They're
did not
responsible for the
concern
crime.
himself
They're responsible
very
for
much
the
with the
wackadoo
individual,
style of
and he
violence.
didn't have to. Because at his time, the very existence of the proletariat made this class a potentially revolutionary class.
Marcuse saying
Now
you
things
have to
have
be
changed
intolerant
considerably
against
since.
them.
You
That
know,
type
the
of
question is
person,
to what
those
extent
people.
can the present working class in the advanced industrial countries still be called a proletariat? The Western European countries have abandoned this
I find it a little
concept
suspicious they're
altogether. Now,
anti-Mosque.
what has taken place is a large-scale integration of perhaps the majority of the population
I bet half of
into
Twitter
the existing capitalist system.
robots.
The organized working class, at least, no longer has nothing to lose but
I
its chains,
remember
but
being
a
proud
lot
enough
more.
to not care about my
And
stats.
this, in
And I
turn,
would check who was
took
following
place
me.
not only on a
I used to
material
get the
but
good
also on a
ratio
psychological basis.
because I had
The
that little
consciousness
historical tidbit
of
thingy.
the dependent
And
population
the Kimberlin
changed.
thing.
It was one of the most striking
So I had
phenomena
a pretty
to
good
see to what
ratio.
extent
But I didn't
the
want robots. I
ruling
didn't want a
power
fake.
structure
I didn't
could
want fake
manipulate,
numbers.
manage, and
There used to be a
control
website you
not
could go
only the
to.
consciousness but also the subconscious and
Or after our
unconscious
consciousness.
of
I
the
picked that up from
individual.
watching this thing.
Therefore, at my friends at the Frankfurt School considered psychology
This is from the
one of
Philosophy
the
Overdose channel, which I sort of don't
branches
recommend,
of knowledge
except for the
that
some
had to
of it.
be integrated with Marxian theory.
A
By
lot of
no
people
means
are full of it.
replacing Marxian theory, but taking it into Marxian theory.
You yourself have
A
done
lot
a
of
lot
people,
in your
like this
writings
guy
to try to
Bryan
marry
Magee.
Freudianism and Marxism. And
This
I
Bryan
think
Magee
that
guy is a complete
some
waste of
people would
time.
say that this simply can't be done because the two patterns of explanation are incompatible with each other. I mean, to put it extremely briefly, Marxist theory locates the ultimate level of explanation of human affairs in technique. The theory, put very simply, is that the level of development of the means of production in a society at any given time determine the formation of
So
classes
good,
in that
technique.
society, and that in turn determines the relationships of individuals to each other, and on that basis grow up
Marcuse
what
with a
Marxists call the
PhD.
superstructure of
The
ideologies,
famous
religions,
Herbert
philosophy,
Marcuse, and
art,
this
and so
guy
on. Now, according to
right
Freud,
there, that
something
Freemason
entirely different is the ultimate explanation of human behavior. The ultimate explanation, according to him, lies in the repressed contents of the unconscious.
Talk it up. They talk up at their soldiers.
Wishes, fantasies, fears, feelings, and so on.
A lot of their targets, they want the next
as a result of distortions in our earliest relationships, above all with our parents. And he explains not only social behavior, but also ideologies, art, religion, and so on, in terms of the
Jimmy Dore part is to
of the repressed contents of the psyche.
Those other people
these are two entirely different kinds of explanation of the same set of phenomena.
So
how can
Brad Blog, it looked like Brad Blog mattered.
I think they can easily be married.
They got suckered into the Brad Blog.
I think there are two extremely different interpretations.
He was promoted by
of two different
Democratic Underground
of the same whole, the same
and Raw Story. The Larissa Alexandrovna. And she was close with one of those CIA types,
drives, which
like a Kiriakou.
Stipulated,
the guy's name was Larry Johnson. This wasn't that long ago. The internet is only
eros and
for about 20
thanatos
years.
Develop within a specific given
social It's been around like maybe 30 years,
which in one way or the other regulates the manifestation of these primary drives.
When I got into it.
Now, the social impact
goes
even further than that. According to
keep
Freud,
a distance from it.
The more intense the repression
90s,
in a society,
I was still like,
more
this is stupid.
What happened is a mobilization of surplus aggressiveness against this repression. Now, since, again, according to Freud, repression is bound to increase
the YouTube did
with the progress
of
civilization.
2007, they showed
up. At the same time and parallel to it, aggressive energy, surplus aggressiveness,
that's when
is going to be mobilized and is going to be
daily cost type places.
In other words, with the progress of civilization, we will have a progress in destructive.
Turned out Malitzis
and it seems to me no hypothesis can better explain
guy.
What happens today than that one.
I think it will, occur to some people.
Well, we all know what happened. There's just no way to articulate
you have catalogued a very formidable list
that's
of
left for the Poinkins with
theory and
truly effed up faces.
Failure to predict the
He's definitely
of capitalism,
closing in on looking like that guy went.
The absence of any theory or attitude to the individual. You've also talked about other entirely new theories like Freudianism, which came on the scene
after
Marx,
scrunchy face, up and down.
Couldn't have been accommodated by Marx in his outlook. A lot of people will say, well, since you were so conscious of this enormous range of defects in Marxism, why did you want to remain Marxists?
If you're going to pity a guy like
try to hang on to
say like,
a discredited
you got to pity the slave owner back in the
Why
day.
not try to liberate your thought category?
It's pretty much
together and actually look at reality afresh.
The same people.
Easy answer, because I do not believe that the theory as such
has been
falsified.
To discriminate,
what has happened
single out anyone based
that
on
some
anything,
of the concepts of Marxian theory,
gender,
as I said before,
that's all good.
have to be re-examined. But
this
is not something from outside brought into Marxist theory. That is something Marxist theory itself, as a historical theory, demands. Now, it is relatively easy for me to enumerate, to give you a catalogue of the decisive
concepts. I had something good to say. It was probably the most important thing that was ever going to be said
in the development of
anywhere at any time.
The concentration of economic power.
Poof, gone.
The fusion of economic and political power. The increasing intervention of the state into the economy. The increasing difficulty.
This is a friendly guy.
In
and he's generous.
Stemming the tendential decline in the rate of profit. The need for engaging in a neo-imperialism in order to create markets and possibilities of enlarged accumulation of capital, and so on. I think this is a formidable catalogue, and it speaks a lot for Marxian theory.
Well, I don't want to get into a political argument. I'd love to do that.
This guy wanted to tear apart Marx.
The purpose of this program is to elicit your views on a further range of topics. But I can't let what you've said.
Mike Wallace tried to do that.
I mean, to take only the first two of your lists.
And Eric Fromm was like, "Well, I'd be in good company."
There's been increasing concentration
to
of
be
economic
spoken
power,
of with
but
Karl
surely
Marx.
through the invention of the joint stock company, the ownership of capital.
Mike the Show Wallace was shattered. He was like, "What?"
You talk about the convergence of economic and political power. I would say yes, but what has happened in the West, at least, is that the decisive control over the economy has passed into the hands of elected politicians, who in the democracies are directly elected by the mass of the people. And
Sensing
they take the basic
fruit,
decisions in the society.
Well, you know that with your first statement about the joint stock companies, you express one of the main concepts of Marxist revisionism,
sexual preference,
introduced first by Engels himself. They considered the joint stock companies with a dispersed ownership already as three forms of a socialist society. Now we know today that this is obviously wrong, and you will not maintain that, for example, in the great multinational corporations, the stockholders control the policy, national and global, of these corporations. It is not the ownership alone that matters, but the control of the which is decisive. As far as the state is concerned and the role of the politicians, do you believe that the politicians make their decisions entirely by themselves as free individuals, or isn't there some kind of link between the policymakers and the great economic powers in the society?
Well, the politicians certainly aren't dominated by the great economic powers. But anyway, I think I will have to let that pass reluctantly and get back to the Frankfurt School.
From South Africa.
We've talked in general terms and about the Frankfurt School. I mentioned two or three of the individuals in my opening remarks, but I think it would be especially interesting to hear just a word from you about who the main individuals were and what they were like, because after all, they were your close friends and associates.
And then I combined the files.
Was the director of the institute. He was not only a thoroughly
Magee tries to get him to smear
a knowledgeable philosopher and sociologist, but also in a strange sense, a financial designer who could take care very well of the material basis, as it were, of the institute, not only in Germany, but also afterwards in the United States. A brilliant man, and nothing that was written in the periodical of the institute and afterwards was written without previous discussion with him and with the other collaborators at the institute.
Surprised Magee never had on Eric Fromm.
A genius. I have to call him a genius. Because I have never seen anyone who was, as you already mentioned, so equally well at home in philosophy, sociology, psychology, music, whatever it may be. It was absolutely amazing. When he talked, it could be printed without any change. It was perfectly ready for print. Then are those who are unjustly neglected or forgotten. Leo Lowenthal, the literary critic of the Institute, Franz Neumann, a brilliant legal philosopher, Otto Kirchheimer, equally well familiar in legal philosophy, Frederick Pollock, and especially Hendrik Grossman, the most orthodox of all Marxist economists I have ever met. He predicted the collapse of capitalism for a very specific year. In the meantime, it turned out it wasn't quite correct.
Walter Benjamin,
like the medieval church
reproduction,
exactly.
The mechanical,
and
the mechanical
Pollock,
reproduction of
who
art,
after all wrote, I think, the first article in which he tried to argue that there are no compelling internal reasons why capitalism should
philosophy.
Now, one of the things that you all as a group pioneered
So it looks at
in the
culture.
perhaps late 20s and certainly early 30s, was the shift of interest in Marxist studies back from the works of the mature Marx to the works of the earlier Marx, the things he wrote when he was more directly
Communication theory is everything.
And one of the many things I think that came out of that, which has been of continuing influence,
Society will have to figure out how
an interest in the notion of alienation.
neuter the
I think
military.
alienation in its modern sense
They need to figure out how to get the
taken up and
military
given a new significance
out of public
and then
life.
almost, you can say, fell out of Western thought for nearly 100 years. And you
They'll have to figure out how to
were
get money
instrumental in
out of
bringing
politics.
it back, weren't you? It would be very interesting to hear your comments on the importance of this idea.
They'll have to figure out safety nets.
That's a very complicated story.
They have to get rid of corruption.
According to Marx,
Corruption everywhere needs
was
to end.
A socio-economic concept. And it meant, basically, this is a very brutal,
the world should be structured
abbreviation,
for the benefit of all.
that under capitalism, men and women could not, in their work, fulfill their own individual humane faculties and needs. That this was due to the capitalist mode of production itself, and could only be remedied by radically changing this mode of production. Now today, the concept of alienation has been expanded and extended to such an extent that this original content is almost entirely lost. An extension all too easy, which I consider not only premature, but also wrong. Because, for example, not every kind of trouble or problem someone has with his girlfriend or a boyfriend is necessarily due to the capitalist mode of production.
In other words, you think that the idea has been trivialized.
Trivialized, and it very needs to be restored.
Yes, and that it's in its original significance, it is of fundamental importance.
Fundamental.
Yes, yes. We've talked up to this point in our discussion in rather negative terms. We've talked about what the Frankfurt School was against. We've talked about its critique of Marxism, and at least by
tried to smear, you tried to pigeonhole
the capitalist system.
The Frankfurt School and failed Mr. GCHQ.
Well, I would say, to start with the easiest one, one of its decisive positive contributions was a prediction of fascism long before it actually happened. Secondly, what Horkheimer himself considered as a distinguishing characteristic, the interdisciplinary approach to the great social and political problems of the time, cutting across the academic division of labor, applying sociology, psychology, philosophy to the understanding and developing of the problems of the time. And in my view, the most interesting
That's why you never hear about them. When you do, it's from right-wingers.
Attempt to answer the question, what actually has gone wrong in Western civilization, that at the very height of technical progress, we see at the same time the opposite as far as human progress is concerned. Dehumanization, brutalization.
I think it was Lyndon LaRouche people who
the torture again as normal means of interrogation, the wasteful development of nuclear energy, destructiveness everywhere, and so on. How has this happened? And he, especially Horkheimer, but also the others, went back into not only a social but also intellectual history, and tried to define the interplay between progressive and repressive categories throughout the intellectual history of the West, especially in the Enlightenment, for example, which is usually considered as one of the most progressive phases in history. And the Frankfurt School pointed out to what extent this apparently perfectly clear progressiveness, this liberating tendency, was at the same time tied up with regressive and repressive tendencies.
This picture that you paint of a group of Marxists almost obsessed with the question, what has gone wrong, suggests to me a politics of disillusionment.
Reform,
I mean, there seems to be an aura of disappointed hopes, disappointment
progress,
with
evolution,
the Marxist theory, disappointment perhaps even with the working class itself for failing to be an effective instrument of revolution.
The exceptional
Was there something
people
disappointed or disillusioned or pessimistic at the center of your approach in those days?
Well, if disappointment means, as you formulated, disappointment with the working class, I would decidedly reject it. None of us has a right to blame the working class for what it is doing or what it is not doing. So this kind of disappointment certainly not. There was indeed another disappointment, and that seems to me a very objective attitude.
It's right there in the Wikipedia.
I mentioned it before, namely that the incredible social wealth that had been assembled in Western civilization and mainly as the achievement of capitalism was increasingly used for destroying rather than constructing a more decent and humane society. If you call that disappointment, yes, but I think it's a very justified and objective disappointment.
And you saw your central task as being
He's clobbering Magee. You can tell by one guy.
How had it come about?
Marcuse is strong and happy.
Enterprise of the
Magee
Frankfurt School was a critical one.
Definitely. Therefore, the term critical theory today for
feels like a mercenary
writings of the Frankfurt School.
One thing that the members of the Frankfurt
scripted,
School
that's it. They're
exhibited very considerable concern with from the beginning was
the people
aesthetics.
we see.
And this, I think, differentiates it from most other
scripted.
philosophies, certainly from most other political philosophies. And you yourself have written a lot in recent years about aesthetic matters.
So you get this
Why did you
really
and your
tiny-minded
regard aesthetics
Bryan Magee,
well,
with
I
a giant
believe, and it was Adorno who is, to whom I'm closest in this respect, I believe that in art, literature, and music, insights and truth are expressed which cannot be communicated in ordinary language, let's say in prose for brevity's sake, and that with these truths, images,
I haven't scromated
of an entirely new dimension is opened, which is either repressed or tabooed in reality. Namely, the image of a human existence and of nature no longer confined within the norms of a repressive reality principle, but really striving for their fulfillment and gratification, even at the price of death and catastrophe. I try to illustrate it by saying that let me use a terrible word, the message of art and literature
just realized those were real people who were just
the
willing
should
to
be
do all the reading and writing,
so
speaking.
As the lovers of all time.
So I'm not jealous of Marcuse. I'm grateful to him.
King Lear experienced it.
So privileged
as Anthony and Cleopatra experienced it.
Show
in
for
other
him.
words, a rupture with the established reality principle. At the same time, the invocation of the images of liberation.
In other words, what you're saying now ties up with what you were saying very near the beginning of our discussion.
Memory is beyond
your
words.
insistence that socialism should be concerned with a different quality.
Memory is everywhere.
Not only with material matters.
In the
and that
body.
means that you, at least, see literature as a repository of new values. And you
Christian
don't
Marty said
see
we
it
can
as
stop recording.
A critique of existing society or a revolutionary instrument.
I'm going to agree with him.
Marxist critics, literary critics.
I would say it is all authentic literature is both. It is on the one hand accusation of the existing society, but on the other hand, and internally linked to it, always the images of liberation. I certainly do not believe that you can give any adequate explanation of a literary work simply in terms of the class struggle.
What's he talking about? I wasn't listening.
Well, this is
I
a
already
field
saw
in
this.
which thinkers in
I
the
basically
tradition
wanted to
of the
point out that
Frankfurt
this
school, like
guy
yourself, are now doing
is a
fresh and
plant.
original work.
Why is
What
he
other
doing that with his
areas do you
hand?
think this school of philosophy, this tradition
Well, at least
of
if you look at
philosophy,
him,
is going to have to concern itself with in the immediate
his
future?
head and eyes aren't completely
Well, I
all
can
over
in
the
this
place.
respect only talk of myself.
And then on all those shows,
And I would say
Cyrus
that
lived.
far more
Their
attention
heads
should
moving
be
all
paid
over
to the
the
women's
place.
liberation movement. I see in the women's liberation movement today a very strong, radical potential. Now, I would have to give a lecture
Women are
in order
high.
to
Give
explain
them
do that.
why
the
I
power.
do that. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
I
I
agree.
cannot.
As long as
Let
it's
me
not
at
like
least try
Margaret
to
Thatcher
say it in
for the women.
two sentences.
Hillary Clinton. I mean, that
All
shouldn't count.
domination in recorded
That's
history
not
up
what he
to
was
date was
talking about.
patriarchal domination. So if we should indeed live to see not only a equality of
I like the
the
German
woman
accent.
before the law,
Not gonna
whatever it
lie.
is, but the
You ever see the Farrah
deployment
Franzak show?
of what is called the specific
She
feminine
coined this
qualities
phrase.
throughout the society.
She says,
For example, non-violence,
I'm not gonna lie.
receptivity, tenderness. This would indeed be, or perhaps could be, the beginning
That's
of a
funny to
qualitatively
prove
different
that they're all
society,
scripted. It's
the very
funny.
antithesis to
They're all out in the
male
open.
domination with its violent
Now
and
everyone
brutal
can see what I was
character.
saying,
Now,
and
I'm
they can do it for
myself perfectly
themselves.
conscious of the fact that
Everyone
these
now
so-called
has the
specific
opportunity to go,
feminine
oh
qualities
wow,
are
that
socially
guy,
conditioned.
he's a
I
little
was going to say there are
fixated
people
on
who
that,
would regard
maybe
it as
a bit too much,
sexist to
but
say that
All
they
right.
are
oh my
Now,
God, he was
specifically
right.
I don't care.
qualities.
They are
Yes.
socially conditioned, but to a great extent they are available. They are
He's
there.
saying if we
So
have to
why
act
not
like
use them the way
chicks
they
for a
are,
better universe, then we'll
regardless of
do
the
it.
question as to their origin?
You don't have to
I'd like to end our discussion,
debate
Professor
who's the
Marcuse, by
better
putting to you one or two of
species,
the
men or
main
women.
criticisms that are commonly made of your work.
That's what
I've
he
really
meant.
put the chief one to
If
you
I had to
already,
guess.
and that was a long way back in the discussion.
This
when I
guy
said to you, given
is
your
a tool.
awareness of so many things wrong with Marxism, why do you remain a Marxist? I won't put that to you again because you've already indicated what your reply
Because
is.
I think it's correct.
Yes, but there are others too.
Marx was a
For
genius.
example, it's commonly said of the new left movement that has developed to such a large degree out of your work that that it is elitist, that you have these little groups of, for the most part, middle class and
He's still attacking
some would say
the
self-admiring
academics.
intellectuals, divorced from the working class, as you yourself acknowledged earlier, regarding themselves as the instruments of revolution.
State power doesn't want
And that the whole thing has become
anything
trendy,
outside
has become
of their
fashionable,
reach.
and above all has become
They believe
dissociated
that everything
with
is
the real
national security,
working class that it was all supposed originally to be about.
and thus
Well, the term
media needs to be
elitist I would
controlled.
reject entirely. I think
Politics,
it is another expression
companies,
of the self-inflicted masochism among the Lulef.
That's why you could be just
It
walking
isn't
down
an
the street and a
elitism.
cop will
What we have are
start bothering
simply groups, which I would like to call catalyst groups, which, because of the privilege of their education and training, indeed develop intelligence, theory, as remote from the material process of production. That cannot be remedied by any dictum. This can be remedied only in the process of change itself. Now, I have never maintained that these catalyst groups could ever replace the working class as subjects and agents of the revolution. They are educational groups, mainly political, but not only political education. Their main task is the development of consciousness, trying to counteract the management and control of consciousness by the established power structure, and so on. But they are certainly not a substitute for the working class itself. Now, the second point you brought up, the language. To a great extent,
Now,
I
this
agree.
was, if I may stop you here, Professor Marcuse, this was something I said to you before we went on the air.
4 minutes left.
So let me say it again so that the viewers will know. This was something that I was saying in criticism of you when we were talking earlier. What I said then, and I'll repeat it now,
Bryan Magee does not look happy about this one.
Something that may sound like a trivial criticism, but is not trivial, is that so many of the writings of the Frankfurt School are in fact very, very difficult to read. Worse than that, they're turgid, sometimes unintelligible. I exempt, and I do it sincerely, yours from this. Your writings
are bad enough.
Your writings, Adorno, for example. Earlier in this discussion, you described Adorno as a genius. Now, I find
this guy has been attacking the Frankfurt School people.
Now, that seems to me to constitute an enormous barrier between the ideas you were trying to disseminate and the public you were
He wasn't trying to learn anything.
This is a serious criticism. And
he
if
wasn't
anything,
trying to
it's made greater by the fact
Marcuse
that other alternative philosophers are often expanded by writers who are very good writers. For example, in the analytic
put him on the defensive.
There is almost a tradition of wit and verve. I mean, Bertrand Russell.
Magee simulated what could be spoken.
So, incidentally, did Jean-Paul Sartre, probably the leading exponent of existentialism. So when one reads existentialism or
Marcuse had a word hard.
Well, I deliberately didn't mention Heidegger because he doesn't fit my thesis.
Exactly.
But nevertheless, I think it is fair to say that the writings of the Frankfurt School as a whole,
debate's over, the Heidegger thing.
Now, why was that? Why is it?
Well, to a great extent, to some extent, I agree with you. And I confess that there are many things in Adorno I don't understand. I want at least to say one word about his justification. It was that ordinary language, ordinary prose, even a little sophisticated one, has been so much permeated by the establishment, by the express so much the control and the manipulation of the individual by
that's why
the
they steal
that already in the language you use, you have to indicate the rupture with conformity. Therefore, the
in the Lenny Bruce movie,
to convey this rupture already in the syntax, in the grammar, in the
one of those movies, guy was saying, "We're in the soup."
Now, whether or not
and
that is acceptable, I don't know.
Like
the only thing I would say there's an equally great
those are a few more examples
in the premature popularization of the terribly complex problems we face today.
It's pretty funny. They can't fix it. Those guys are
incapable Professor Marcuse,
of talking without
I would like to put a personal question to you, and I do it because you
someone like Marcuse or myself, we
must
don't
happened
need
to
be
remarkably
scripted.
few human beings in history.
Think,
you spend almost a whole lifetime as an academic
to be authentic
to a comparatively small circle, your pupils, the readership of the rather special.
With 1 minute to go, Bryan Magee continues
and then suddenly,
to try to
when you were literally nearly 70, you became almost overnight, one is tempted to say, a world figure.
He became a rock
this is
star.
An astonishing thing.
They try to smear him as
what was it like to have it happen to you?
Trying to shut down the country.
Well, on the one hand, I enjoyed it tremendously. On the other hand, I found it somehow not deserved. And I may end, if this is the end, on a rather
He's like when Noam Chomsky got popular.
No, it isn't so impertinent.
When did Noam get popular? About 5-10 years ago.
When I was asked how is it possible, I said, I appear only as such a figure because the others are still more stupid than
popular the whole way.
But no one could ever have expected it, and I suppose
now all of a sudden everyone wants him on the show, even though he's like 105.
Thank you very much, Professor Marcuse.
Magee was clobbered by Herbert Marcuse. That was beautiful. That was a knockout. Victory to truth, victory to Marcuse. Okay, that's the show. I'm sorry that I wasn't that good this time. I'll try to get something a bit more fluffy. I think the pink champagne stuff brings up the best in me. Just something that's a little more a little easier to follow. That was heavy duty stuff. I tried to keep up with it, but it's late in the day. I already took my drowsy pill. I've got a pretty good heart. It's nice and healthy. I had a little artery situation a few years back, but I've been fixed. Been cured. I won't be having another heart attack, I don't think, ever again. Don't smoke cigarettes. That's my advice. Alright, other than that, read the good stuff. You'll thank me later. Read some Eric Fromm. Don't believe everything. Just open up the mind and read the smart people. If you gotta take a while to read it sentence by sentence, there's nothing wrong with that. You gotta start somewhere. And you break it down, you can tend to know what something means just by stretching the mind a little bit. Stretch the imagination. They're called cloze. C-L-O-Z-E. So you just look around at the other words, and those help give you a clue as to what the word you don't know what that means. And that's how you learn how to think. Because you're not just going, I must go to that dictionary. What does that word mean? By the time you get back, you forget what was going on. Unless you just take it line by line. Try to get a feel for the author. Keep things in context. Keep the mind open. You never know. A human is a human is a human. But sometimes it takes a little moving around to find your tribe, so to speak.